The next question we got was, what role does mercy play in chastity? How should we respond with love in regards to people's pasts in even
Mm,
current unchastity? And how do you avoid rash judgments?
good stuff. Yeah. I know the context might depend, and I know this question is maybe a little bit more open-ended, but I would say mercy, I think, always has a role to some extent. Obviously, justice is important too, but mercy, whenever it can be extended, I think should be. But when it comes to people's like past sexual mistakes, one of the things that if you're in a relationship, maybe let's hit that first, and then we can go elsewhere. Before I would argue that before engagement, you shouldn't divulge past mistakes, but not in great detail. This is something that I learned from Jason essentially, that it's important to share your past. There is a temptation though sometimes to share too much. So I remember Jason telling me that you need to be careful there, that you're not going into great detail. Just give them the kind of the general overview, and if they have questions, you can answer those questions. But even then, be careful of sharing too much, because what can happen is your boyfriend, girlfriend, fiance, spouse's past could then haunt you for years. It can just be kind of ingrained in your imagination, and you might struggle thinking like, oh, she's been with this guy or that guy, or he's been with this girl or that girl. And so I think it's important to divulge it, but to be prudent in what you say. When it comes to relationships where there's maybe a question or a struggle with modesty, or I imagine, like, I know Jason sometimes talks about this, where maybe a man who curses or he speaks impurely, or maybe a woman who and guys can dress immodestly too, but a woman maybe who dresses immodestly. Those are tricky conversations to have. What I've often found is that it's often best for a male to talk to a male about something like that. A woman, I think, can do it. It's often best for a woman to talk to a woman. So if there's someone, maybe if you notice like a girl who's a friend of yours, but you're maybe not super close to, and you've noticed that maybe she's dressing in a way that's revealing, and maybe I know this is a sensitive topic. I'm probably offending someone by saying all this, but and dressing in a way that maybe is not modest, let's say, and in that case, I think it's often best if another woman says something. I think a guy can say something if you're close enough, but that's just what I've learned from the past. So, I think there's something beautiful and good about accepting people exactly as they are, but at the same time, we do need to call them on to live a moral life, a good life. And so I think one of the probably weakest parts of our culture today is that we're often afraid to say things that offend people, me included. And we really need to speak up. We need to be tactful. We need to say things in a way that, as I would argue, is as diplomatic as we can. But we need to be careful. And I know one of the things my wife was telling me about with her old school, she was looking at some pictures, I think, on social media, and she just found that the outfits that the students were wearing were just like super immodest. The girls were wearing skirts that were just like really high riding, and it was something that to my wife, a woman, was like, yeah, just that does not sit okay with me, especially since I was a student. That's my alma mater. That's my high school. That's something that's not okay. And so in those situations, I think, yeah, I know it's a big topic, but those are a few things that I think if you can do it tactfully, it's always best. Because I have seen people do it the wrong way. I have seen people where they like try to corner someone and like, hey, you're dressing really immodestly, you need to change that. And it's like, that never goes over really well. So maybe it can work in some sense. But one of the things I wanted to say on that note is, if someone's living, maybe let's put the modesty thing aside, in a life of sin, who's, I know people right now who they're living lives of sin. It's something that I don't want them to be doing, but they're doing. I know either directly from them or from other people. And in those cases, we want to love the person but hate the sin, and we want to love them enough to work up enough like influence with them where we can say something to make them think, to hopefully change the way that they're living. But I think the one foundational thing overall is just what John Paul II says with the personalistic norm, that the only adequate response to any person is that of love. And love, as we know through St. Thomas Aquinas, is willing the good of the other. And so we always have to remember, what is their ultimate good? and what does willing that in this particular situation look like? So so definitely a few thoughts. There's a few other thoughts that I had, but Josiah, I want to throw it to you because I know this question is maybe going all over the place because it's a little bit more open-ended.
Yeah, it's a good question though. Something I said in the past on the show actually, but I'll say it again because I think it's really just easy go-to advice. If you're on, if you're in college and you're in like a Catholic student organization, a lot of times there'll be Focus Missionaries there. So if you're blessed enough to have Focus Missionaries and you're a young man in one of these, focus groups or like the Catholic student organization on your campus, you got Focus Missionaries and you see, a particular woman or maybe the women in general, like dressing immodestly, just go to one of the women's missionaries and just say, hey, this is really like, I don't think I'm being, overly picky, overly prudish here. This is just, it's, a near occasion of sin for me. I would really appreciate if you could mention to the women just when it's just them. So that's something I've said. If you're a lady and you have a similar problem, whether it's with speech, the way you guys talk, the way they interact with the women, go to one of the men's missionaries. If you're in a youth group, most of the time at Catholic parishes, I don't know, it's been a really long time since I've been in a Protestant youth group, but if you're in high school and you're a Catholic young person, a lot of times it's like a married couple that's the youth ministers. Everyone that I was in high school was a married couple, so you could go to that couple and say like, hey, the guys are, I don't think that they should be talking this way. It's causing problems. It's a near occasion of sin for us. Ladies, can, Mr. So-and-so talk to the guys, or vice versa, the ladies aren't dressing. Can Mrs. So-and-so talk to the ladies? So that's something. If it's a current life, I'm not exactly tactful myself, so I don't have any advice there for you, unfortunately.
No, that's good. And part of the reason, I don't mean to pick on the ladies with the modesty thing. It's important that we talk about that. But I love your example because it can go both ways. And the person asking the question is a guy, and he specifically mentioned immodesty. So that's why we're touching on that. But yeah, I think, and he mentioned something about avoiding rash judgments. I think it's okay to make judgments. I think we just need to be careful that we're not approaching the person with all truth and no love. I think that's can often be a temptation. And so, again, the personalistic norm from John Paul II is like the only adequate response to the human person is that of love. But love requires telling people the truth. And sometimes, this is something I've been thinking about lately, like love must be tough. I remember talking to a young woman in her 20s who was in a relationship with a guy, and by many accounts, they had a good relationship, but he was going through a lot. He came from a broken family, and he just wasn't treating her well. She wanted to be engaged. They'd been dating for a long time, and it would put her in a really tough spot. He was, moving away, doing kind of his own thing, and not really, pursuing their relationship as she wanted, and I think as she deserved, given the context. There's more details, obviously, I'm not going to share, but in that situation, I just had the conversation with her that, like, yeah, love must be tough. If someone is mistreating you, if someone is living a life that is not good for them, we need to figure out a way to communicate that. We need to put up boundaries, not as something that's like mean and because we want to hurt the other person, but because they deserve it and we deserve it, and it's ultimately good, best for the relationship. And so figuring out how to do that, in conversations is always hard, but I think it's a worthwhile pursuit. And I think one thing too, when it comes to like the whole rash judgments and maybe like, being judgmental, because that's a temptation for a lot of people. Some people are just like super judgmental to an extent that's like not healthy. Not just like making judgments with their minds, but they're like maybe constantly talking about people in a way that they shouldn't be. I would say one of the things that's helped me, I heard this quote recently, that it's hard to hate up close. It's hard to hate up close. And I think there's so much truth to that we can criticize people who are online. We can criticize people, who are across the country or the world. But when you actually get to know someone and know, understand more of like why they're living the way that they are, I think you could actually start to have a lot of compassion. But again, I'm not suggesting that we just leave them there. Again, I think God loves us as we are, but too much to leave us there. He wants us to repent. He wants us to grow, to be holy. But I think, we need to kind of go down with people in the messiness of their life, and then hopefully bring them out of that and closer to God. So those are just a few thoughts. The one final thing I would say is Jay Stringer. I love Jay Stringer's work. If you guys aren't familiar with him, he's a Christian therapist who wrote an awesome book called Unwanted. He's been on the podcast before. He, talks about just healing from, sexual trauma or mistakes in the past. And I would just recommend his stuff. And, I think that it would be really helpful, especially if you're dealing maybe with your own sexual brokenness, or maybe your boyfriend or girlfriend's past, to start looking, reading his material and getting into that. Jason, again, I had him on the show. I don't know the podcast episode, but there's a lot of good stuff. So if there's time later, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about Stringer's stuff. But that stuff has been really helpful for myself and for people who I've walked with who, are dealing with some sort of sexual brokenness in the past.
Awesome. So, follow up in the live chat here.
That's good.
Even if you're a few years after quitting pornography, for example, should you eventually bring up that you were once addicted?
So I assume you're talking about like maybe a potential fiance or fiance, boyfriend, girlfriend. Yeah, I would bring that up. I think that's great. I think one of the problems with perhaps a lot of marriages, I don't know how common this is that we don't actually divulge everything about ourselves. And I think we need to do that before marriage. I think it's only going to, be in your benefit and the benefit of the relationship. Again, with prudence, we don't need to share every little nitty-gritty detail, but I think it's a good thing. I did this with my wife, by the way, before we got engaged. So there were some things from my past that I was really ashamed of, and I never, I'd shared maybe with some mentors or therapists, but it was stuff that it was really hard to talk about. And so I remember just making this commitment. I'm like, I'm not going to ask this woman to marry me unless she just knows all about me. And so I had probably the hardest conversation I ever had in my life with her. I just shared, hey, here are these mistakes that I made. You knew maybe some of it, but not all of it. And I just want you to know, just so you know who you're marrying, what you're getting into. And, I was honest with her, like, that's in my past. I'm not, doing that anymore. But I think it honestly brought us closer, because it would have been important for me too, to know, like, could she live with that? And if she couldn't, then that's okay. That would have been something that I, would have been good information for me, for my discernment, but she took it so well, and she loved me through it, and it made us stronger. And so I would say, yeah, definitely share that, at the appropriate time. I think, if you go on a first date and throw that on the table, probably not wise, but later on, I think that's a really good thing, which I assume that's what you were thinking by asking the question. But yeah, I would definitely mention it. Would you disagree, Josiah?
No, I think you should mention it. I actually want to lovingly but firmly challenge the phrasing of the question. Just because I think pornography addiction is such an epidemic,
Yes.
we've kind of normalized it and excused it in some ways, and I don't think this questioner is doing that intentionally. But the phrasing of once addicted, in any other addiction, you're not once an addict. If you were to go to an AA meeting, there'll be somebody there who's 20 years sober, and when they talk, they're going to start with, my name is John, my name is John Doe, and I'm an addict, and I think, even if you're a few years after quitting and you're, completely clean for a couple years, I would just be very careful with phrasing it as, I used to be an addict. Yeah.
Yeah. That's such a great conversation, because I come up against this a little bit in my ministry, because I'm working with quote unquote children of divorce. I'm a child of divorce. We're talking about being an addict. Mm-hmm. I think the labels are helpful. One of the things I've found is just to, I don't know, I guess, and again, this is just me throwing a thought out there. I've struggled a little bit with this idea of I am an addict versus I have an addiction. What do you think about that? Is it that helpful to say I am an addict? I get the purpose of saying I'm powerless to this thing. It like has some power over me. But at the same time, it almost seems like it's this like label that they walk around with over their heads that is that helpful? I guess is the question.
I have no idea. You could be completely right about that. But I think either way, like, don't phrase it as I used to be.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, like don't phrase it as I used to have an addiction.
Okay.
Yeah, like either way, it's a current thing. Addiction is addiction, regardless of how many people in our culture have a particular addiction.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, fair. No, I respect that opinion.
So I have no, I mean, you could be totally right about that, frankly. Like I
don't know.
haven't really thought too much about it. My initial impulse is that it's probably better than, putting your, like, we want to take our identity in Christ. But I'm just, still, I would fall back to like let's make sure we're not weakening our resolve against our addictions by thinking that they're, beat, like every day you wake up and you have to beat it again. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think that's the whole point. And, who am I to say that really, because of the 12-step programs have gotten a lot of people, freedom, sobriety. So I think there's something to that, but I think it's a great question. And I know those conversations are hard. And one of the things I heard from Emily Wilson, you guys are probably familiar with Emily Wilson. She's a speaker, YouTuber, author. She says that sometimes in relationships, especially, dating, getting closer to marriage, it can be hard to have those hard conversations. And you might even sense that the boyfriend, girlfriend you're with, the guy or girl you're with, is maybe holding back. And so one of the questions she came up with, which I think is just genius, is asking, like, is there anything that you haven't told me that you're afraid to tell me? Is there anything you haven't told me that you're afraid to tell me? Because she says when you have these really difficult conversations, there's kind of two challenges. One is just broaching the topic, like bringing it up, spending some time like talking about it, getting the courage to say something, right? That's hard. And then the second thing is actually divulging what it is that you need to say. And so she says, when you ask that question, is there anything you haven't told me you're afraid to tell me, you kind of take away the first challenge. You're opening the space for them to have that conversation with you. Doesn't mean they will, and it might, who knows, maybe it's not the right timing. But I think it's a really genius tactic that I would recommend.
Yeah, that's a great tactic. Don't do it too early in a relationship.
Boom. Agreed.
Just want to throw that on because
wait like a week, right?
Yeah. That's a second date conversation. That's a joke for anybody. That's a joke. We're trying to give serious advice, but we're also trying to not be super depressing. But yeah, wait, that's like a couple months into the relationship conversation. Don't try pulling that on early. So
yeah. We I think we had been dating like a year and a half, which maybe in some people's opinion might be too long, and that's fair. And I probably should have talked with my now wife sooner, but that was where we were at.
Yeah. Well, praise God, she gave you the grace. So. Yeah,
no, for sure. And yeah, thankfully I had that stuff well in my past, and by God's grace and a lot of help from other people, got my act together. So. Yeah. And as we say with all questions, if it's something you're really struggling with, talk to a priest. Boom.
Hey, if you enjoyed that clip, I'd encourage you to please like, subscribe, share, comment. That helps show it to more people. And then also submit your question at the email live@chastity.com, or submit your question or call in through our Discord server so we can talk to you in person on our next show.